Back in 1940, Hitler personally conquered 100 million people in just 14 months, while his generals advised caution on everything. Were they right? Were they wrong? And what if Hitler had let his generals run the war after 1940? Would the fate still be the same, or would he achieve many more goals? Subscribe now because this changes how you understand World War II forever. And watch till the end because Hitler's fate might not be what you think it would have been. The time Hitler was right. By the end of 1940, Adolf Hitler had personally overseen the conquest of countries like Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. Today, if we think about it, that is a huge achievement. The combined population of those countries was around 100 million people, which is roughly 3/4 of the entire United States at that time. The combined duration of those campaigns was less than 14 months. His generals had advised him on almost every single one. They told him that Poland would take longer than it did. They warned that a decisive armored thrust through the Ardennes was nothing more than reckless gambling. The French command largely agreed with him, treating the region as effectively impassable to tanks. Erich von Manstein's plan, the one that actually worked, was initially rejected by the general. The German columns that moved through the Ardennes in May 1944 formed a traffic jam stretching across 160 miles, from the Meuse all the way back to the Rhine. A single Allied airstrike on that day turned the war's most audacious gamble into a catastrophe. That's how close the inevitable French collapse actually was. In the 12 months in which Germany performed this military achievement of the 20th century, the professional officer corps was consistently behind the curve. When people tell you that Hitler should have stepped back and let his generals run the war, it's worth asking exactly which war they thought the generals would have won. Post-1940. Hitler's intervention in operational command after 1940 produced a documented series of disasters. First of all, the halt order at Dunkirk in May 1940 helped make it possible for 338 Allied troops to escape across the Channel. Troops who would form the seasoned corps around which a much larger British and Commonwealth's Wealth Army was rebuilt. The order originated with Gerd von Rundstedt and was confirmed by Hitler over the objection of panzer commanders like Guderian. Many historians argue that, without the pause, the Germans would have inflicted far heavier losses on the retreating force. Britain would have faced the rest of the war without the army, admitted to keep fighting on land. This confirmation of that order against the grain of his command line troops shaped everything that came after that. Operation Barbarossa in 1945 was the next big argument. Back in August, with Army Group Center driving towards Moscow and the Soviet command structure visibly collapsing, Hitler redirected the advance south towards Ukraine. His general Heinz Guderian most vocally argued that Moscow was the decisive objective. Its capture would sever Soviet rail logistics, and the psychological blow of losing the capital might collapse the Soviet Union itself entirely. Hitler overruled them. He sent the panzer to Kiev and roughly 600,000 Soviet prisoners in the largest encirclement in military history. From there, he sent the exhausted, supply-depleted panzer groups back to the north in October. The speed of advance to that point had almost been incomprehensible. When the 4th Panzer Division rolled into the city of Oriol on October 3rd, the advance had been so rapid that the city's trams were still running, packed with daily commuters who had no idea that the front had just arrived at their doorstep. That momentum was non-existent by December. They ran out of steam within sight of Moscow's suburbs. The Soviet winter also followed, and Germany had no answer to that. Germany never threatened Moscow again. Then came 1942, with the Battle of Stalingrad producing the argument that ended most debates. Senior German commanders from the pocket to Berlin, including Friedrich Paulus, trapped inside Stalingrad, Manstein at the Army Group Don, Kurt Zeitzler as Army Chief of Staff in Berlin, all told Hitler the 6th Army needed to break out while it still could. However, Hitler refused. 300,000 German soldiers were encircled, and roughly 90,000 marched into Soviet captivity. Perhaps 5,000 ever returned. Hitler had personally ordered the city held, personally promised relief that never really came, and even rejected the operational solution his generals unanimously recommended. That is the case here, and those decisions and their consequences are all in the historical records. But the case for the general only holds up if you look at what they were actually asking to do. So let's talk about that. The war they wanted. The German General Staff did not object to the war. They did not object to the invasion of the Soviet Union. Crazily, several of them have been planning eastward expansion since the 1920s, but they objected to the timeline, the logistics, and the specific operational choices. Their alternative was not, don't start a war of racial annihilation in the West. Their alternative was to start more carefully and do more efficiently. Erich von Manstein, who was the general that was most frequently cited as the man who would have won the war for Germany, never argued against Barbarossa. He argued about its execution. Even if we look at his memoirs, written after the wars, they are a masterclass in blaming Hitler for every failure, by positioning the general staff as the voice of sober reason. They were enormously influential in shaping how Western audiences understood the war for decades. In the early Cold War, Western militaries were actively studying German operational doctrine and relying on German generals as sources and advisors. Those generals needed rehabilitation, professionals, not the architects of the War of Annihilation. British military historian John Keegan called the German general memoir tradition a massive act of collective self-exculpation. The generals wrote the books needed to be competent professionals, undone by a madman because the alternative was acknowledging that they had militarily served in the Wehrmacht's role in the occupied East, which was not a secret from the officers' course season. Army group commanders signed off on logistical arrangements that deliberately starved Soviet prisoners of war. Out of those of whom roughly 3 million out of an estimated 5.5 to over 6 million captured, died in German custody. That was not Hitler acting alone. That was also the military intervention. Some historians have argued that Wehrmacht generals running the war without the SS's racial ideology might have reduced the Soviet will to fight. That argument is identifying something real. What it underweights is that the generals and the SS's racial ideology were not separate forces that could be cleanly divided. So, let's run the scenario and see what would happen if Hitler's generals controlled everything. But before that, subscribe to the channel if you are enjoying the breakdown so far. The scenario: here's what would happen. Barbarossa proceeds on the Moscow First Axis. Army Group Center would drive harder and faster in the summer without the August diversion. The encirclement battles will happen earlier. The German advance would reach Moscow's outskirts with better logistics and earlier timing. Will Moscow fall? Possibly. The Soviet government would evacuate to another city in October 1941. That happened in reality too. Stalin stayed, which matters, but the government's administrative machinery was already moving. A Moscow capture in September rather than a stalled advance in December changes the timeline significantly. Here's what could happen next. The Soviet Union does not stop at Moscow. The industrial base had been moving east since 1940, and by the end of 1941, Soviet authorities would relocate more than 1,500 major factories and roughly 16 million workers beyond the Urals. An entire industrial civilization would be dismantled and rebuilt on rails while the front rolled over its old foundations. Workers would reassemble a massive steelwork system at Chelyabinsk and were given 75 days to restart production, working around the clock in frozen fields. They did it in 1956. Chelyabinsk became the world's largest tank factory. Workers called it the Tankograd, which also means tank city. Soviet production of tanks, artillery, and aircraft was already exceeding Germany's by 1942, and even in the disrupted reality of an invasion already underway, it would happen the same. A more rational German operation sequence gets to the Volga faster. It does not get past it. The Koskos oil field, the field Germany needed to continue the war into 1943 and beyond, still remains contested. A general run war that avoids the Stalingrad catastrophe does not really liberate German forces. It probably produces a longer and more stable Eastern Front that bleeds Germany more slowly at a higher cost to the Soviets, while American industrial production scales up behind a British base at Dunkirk, which is already safe. The match that killed Germany was never Hitler's tactics. It was the disparity between what Germany could have produced and what was being produced against it. Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States together were manufacturing war materials at a rate that Germany could never match, regardless of who was running the operational map at Wolf's Lair. A general run war probably extends the conflict. It does not change direction. The question nobody asks is what the Nazi state does with extra time. Extra time. In the real war, Germany's operational incompetence contributed to the speed of its final collapse. The 1944 catastrophe in France, the encirclement in the East, and the accelerating disintegration of Army Group Center in Operation Bagration, all of that ended the war faster and more disciplined military machines might have. But that framing tends to the other side of the ledger. More blood spilled on the battlefield also means that the machinery of mass murder was running longer in occupied Europe. It contains the hidden assumption that a more competent Nazi leadership, pursuing the same ideological goal through more rational military means, would have produced a much better outcome. Better for who exactly is the question the framing really avoids. The men who wanted operational control were already running the occupations simultaneously in the same command zone. Walter von Reichenau, now commanding the 6th Army before Paulus, issued his own severity order, calling for the execution of civilians and prisoners, going further than Hitler ever really asked him to. Walter von Reichenau is celebrated by military historians as one of war's greatest defense geniuses. He stabilized everything by ordering the poisoning of local wells, the deportation of 15,000 Russian men for forced labor, and the complete leveling of over 100 villages in a scorched earth withdrawal. Gerd von Rundstedt commanded Army Group South during the SS operation in Ukraine, providing direct logistical support for the death squads operating in the region, including the events at Babi Yar. That's who was going to run this war. Manstein understood the operational problem. He never acknowledged what solving it would have preserved. The war these men would have run might have been a little bit longer, and the state would have had more time, more capacity, and less external pressure to direct towards the occupied territory. The industrial gap still closes against Germany. The Allied coalition still wins. What changes is the duration and what that duration means for everything living under Nazi administration while the front holds. The whole Hitler ruined everything argument is really a claim that he ruined Germany's war. If that is true, my indictment is far less than what the firm blade lays out. In the end, while the Germans would have won for a little bit longer, the end would still be the same. Drop your position in the comments below. If you are not already subscribed, hit that now, because we are breaking down historical arguments that nobody else touches.